we are the inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to conduct this examination and report to the boroughs in due course. The format of the hearing is a structured discussion that we shall lead. Before we carry on, could I ask the representatives of the boroughs to introduce themselves, please?
Thank you, sir, and good morning, everyone. I'm Dean James. I'm the Planning Policy Manager at the London Borough of Sutton.
And my name's Patrick Witter, Senior Planner at Sutton Council.
Morning, Julia Dorr, Plan Making Team Leader at London Borough of Croydon.
Tara Butler, London Borough of Merton.
Eben van Vester is in London Borough of Merton.
Tom Bright, Principal Planning Policy Officer at the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames.
Thomas Ild, Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames.
Thank you. And could I ask the other participants in the room to introduce themselves, please?
Morning, I'm Vilna Walsh from First Plan, acting for DB Cargo.
Morning, Chris Finesse from Suez Recycling Recovery UK.
Thank you. And I've got Mr. Potter and Mr. Payne on the Zoom link. If you'd like to introduce yourselves, please.
Certainly, sir. Thank you. I'm Alan Potter, and I'm a partner at BPP Consulting, and we are representing 777 Demolition.
Hello, morning. I'm David Payne from BPP Consulting, representing 777 as well.
Thank you. Also present today is the Programme Officer, Carmel Edwards. She's responsible for organising the hearing sessions and for distributing any of the relevant material, and she'll be your first point of contact for any procedural questions. Mr. van der Westenhuizen, if you could give your housekeeping announcements, please.
Yes, Inspector, with regards to mobile phones, please switch them off now or put them on silent mode. Toilets are available at ground level at the main entrance to the Civic Centre, just to the left of the stairs leading up to the council chamber. There's a water dispenser near the entrance to the toilets. Please use the alcohol wipes and hand gel that is available at the table at the entrance to the chamber. There are no fire drills scheduled during the hearing hours today. If the fire alarm sounds, either intermittently or continuously, please leave the building immediately by the nearest available fire exit without stopping to collect belongings. Staff will direct you to the exits and fire assembly point. If you're unable to use the stairs, a member of staff will assist you. The hearing will reconvene if it's safe to do so, otherwise it will stand adjourned. Please ensure that you've signed the attendance sheet on the table at the entrance to the chamber. Please note that this meeting is being filmed for publication on the Council's YouTube channel. Therefore, if you're participating in this meeting, you are consenting to being recorded and the use of those recordings for broadcasting. When the inspector invites participants to speak, they need to press the little silver button with an icon of a head at the base of the microphone in front of them. A red light will shine on the microphone, indicating that the microphone is on, and the camera will focus on the speaker. When the participant has finished speaking, they must press the same button again to switch the microphone off, which will switch the red light off and the camera focus will draw back. Zoom participants should remain muted until the inspectors invite them to speak, and they should use the raised hand tool to indicate to the inspectors when they would like to have an opportunity to speak. And there's an induction loop system for people with hearing difficulties.
Thank you. So just a reminder of the Inspector Norwington and I are tasked with considering the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria of the National Planning Policy Framework, and also whether it is legally compliant. The hearings are intended to assist us in that regard. In submitting the plan, the boroughs consider that it is sound, and that is the starting point for the examination. So if you are challenging the soundness of the plan, then you have to explain why and what changes would make it sound. We have read and will take into account the hearing statements that have been prepared and the original representations that were made. So there's no need for these to be substantially repeated. Instead, our aim is that the discussion moves on from those documents and deals with specific questions that we have or areas where further clarification or explanation might be required. At times, we may ask for a more general contribution or a summary of your position. It's also helpful to stick to the matter in hand and to refrain from commenting on unrelated matters. For people in the room, if you wish to comment, then please indicate this by turning your nameplate on its side. We may also invite contributions from you on specific points where we think this may assist the examination. In speaking during the hearing, we would request you are concise and specific. In particular, if you wish to highlight certain parts of your statement or other documents that form part of the examination, then it will be helpful to us if you can provide the reference. It is open to the boroughs to propose further changes to the plan, and we would ask that they keep a record of possible changes that arise during the discussions. Any main modifications will be subject to future consultation. And there will be a short session at the end of each sitting day to ensure that any modifications or additional items suggested during the course of discussions have been adequately recorded. So before we continue with our discussion of matter 3, are there any procedural questions at this stage? Okay, thank you. So we'll progress now on to our discussion of matter 3. So again, I'd like to start with a general question to the boroughs for their response on the question as it's framed in the matter. So does the plan make adequate provision for the waste management apportionments required by the London Plan and any other arisings? And is it positively prepared in this regard?
Thank you, sir. The general position of the boroughs is that we have made adequate provision for waste management apportionments required by the London Plan. We consider that for apportioned waste, we've identified sufficient capacity to exceed the apportionment figures set out in the London Plan. We consider we've identified sufficient capacity also to exceed the arisings for construction and demolition waste as set out in the plan. In terms of other arisings, as set out in our statements, we considered that they were quite small for other waste streams, and that there was adequate provision for those to be met through cross-boundary movements outside of the plan area, as we've detailed within our statement. So collectively, by managing that apportioned waste and construction and demolition waste within the plan area, and then continuing cross-boundary movements for some of those other arisings where there are small figures involved, we think that we have made overall adequate provision for waste management that's set out by the London Plan.
I wonder if you could explain a bit further the methodology for calculating the construction and demolition arisings, and particular in your view as to whether that would conform with the planning practice guidance advice on that particular matter.
I'm going to invite my colleague Eben to respond to that one, sir. Thank you.
Yes, we do think that the methodology is appropriate, particularly in London. The PBG advises that the starting point should be that you retain the existing waste. However, we feel that was a starting point for national guidance, whereas in London, the topic paper, the London topic paper SLWP 11, as part of the examination library, it says under the subheading forecast for construction, demolition, excavation waste and hazardous waste, it specifically says that this work has been carried out to help the boroughs to plan for waste. And then the work that's referred to there specifically is the SLR report, which is reference SLWP 12. And that document was also, both documents were part of the London Plan examination. So in that document, it sets out the methodology. The SLR report sets out the methodology for London. It demonstrates the generally considered uncertainties around CD&E waste, particularly within the waste data interrogator, and why they looked at reasonable alternatives and 4 alternatives, and why in this instance in London, this is an appropriate strategy, and therefore we feel justified for London that we use the starting point is the WDI, and then it's used with a proxy with the employment growth figures projected with the London Plan. That said, it's worth noting that the current capacity figures show for CD&E that the South London Waste Plan area is about a circa 160,000 tons per annum surplus. So it's quite it's a conservative estimate if the methodology, but besides that, we feel it's appropriate in London, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Mr. Payne or Mr. Potter, as in your hearing statements, you'd expressed some views on that methodology. So I see Mr. Potter's go on screen. Would you like to respond to that point?
Yes, thank you, sir. Yeah, we still remain of the view that the starting point should be what the National Planning Practice Guidance, which is states, which is a static growth. But even if it was to be accepted that the conditions within London would mean that there should be an exception or deviation from that basic guidance, we still contest what the assumed correlation between employment numbers and growth in waste arisings is not justified. We know that the construction sector is going to great lengths to reduce waste arisings, not least because the cost of disposal of waste is rising, but also the cost of materials too. And so we believe that the modelling should have included a assumption around per unit arisings built falling. And also, I would just ask the question, I think that the boroughs said in their comment there that there was some uncertainty, I think, around the data in the waste data interrogator, or WDI as referred to, and what exactly the boroughs see that as being around, because our take on the waste data interrogator is that actually the arises relating to construction demolition waste are quite robust. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. So are there any reactions to that, Mr. van der Westenhuizen?
Just on the point on the on the accuracy of the CD&E waste. There's a lot of issues, significant quantities of coding of the origin of the waste, of CD&E waste in particular. And then there's large quantities that are probably from CD&E waste that is with exempt sites.
And in terms of the use of the employment growth figures, have you got any response to that at this stage?
No, there are probably multiple other types of methodologies. We felt that this particular methodology was readily available. It has been tested through the London plan. It's an appropriate method for our estimates for the arisings in this instance. So I don't have anything further to clarify.
Perhaps just to widen that debate, it's a question for Mr. Potter to just widen that debate. And good morning, Mr. Potter. I think we've met before in a similar forum not too long ago, I think. But I'm trying to understand perhaps how material your concerns are in terms of if there is variation between yourselves and the council regarding the estimates that's been provided, what is the implication of that variation as far as the plan goes? As I understand it, the plan's got a healthy surplus of capacity. So I'm wondering if there is some variation, and it's not going to be a huge variation, there will be changes, I appreciate that, but I'm just trying to understand what is the implication of your concerns as far as this plan goes. So if the council has got it wrong, what's the knock-on effect of that as far as the plan's approach and policies go?
Thank you, sir. And yes, it's good to see you again. Sorry, I wasn't able to join you in person today. With regard to your question, I think, yes, it's a good point. We welcome the fact that the boroughs have now revised their data and have found a larger capacity gap on this stream and indeed on the other streams. So in terms of the critical nature of it, of their findings, it is less critical than it was. I was slightly concerned, though, by a comment that was made by the boroughs yesterday, suggesting that the situation may change from their current assessment. But if they are standing by the assessment to say they've got plenty of surplus capacity, then our concern is perhaps more academic and theoretical than practical in terms of its impact on our clients' interest in this matter.
Okay, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth there, then, and I will ask the council to comment. As I understand what you've said there is that there may be variations. The revised figures actually push it towards more capacity. So whilst we can debate at length, if we wish to do, the reasons for those variations, in terms of the plan, those revised projections don't materially alter the basis on which the council's taking the plan forward. Is that my understanding? In other words, yes, there are variations. Actually, the revision of that has pushed it probably in terms of more capacity, and hence that's on the better side for the plan. And as a consequence of that, there's no material revisions to the data that's supplied in the plan that affects the basis on which the plan's provided. Am I right in thinking that?
As I say, we would agree now with your assessment there, sir, to say that its impact is much reduced, and as long as the boroughs are prepared to stand by their capacity assessments against the forecast, then the forecasts become less significant. Just as a matter of fact, you might say the boroughs in their response, in the hearing today, referred to the exemptions and waste being managed through exemptions. That's a a narrative that's actually quite outdated now. Back in, I think it was 2012, the exemptions were revised from, this is the exemptions from environmental permitting. Prior to that, up to about 50,000 tons of material could be managed through those. But since then, you've got a limit of about 1,000 tons on soils and 5,000 tons on other materials. So the actual scale of potential diversion through that route is significantly reduced. But as you say, at the end of the day, its impact on the plan is less than it was.
Just to confirm from the council that the kind of little discussion that Mr. Potter and I has had there is reflective of your position going forward, that yes, there will be differences. There will always be calculation methodology differences when you get to something of this level. But nonetheless, in terms of the implications of that difference, it's negligible in terms of the basis that the plan's been prepared on.
Yes, that's an accurate summary.
Okay, just developing a bit further the plan's approach to dealing with the CDE arisings. So that alongside the hearing statements, one of the proposed modifications, 1.6. So this is to policy WP2 that seeks to restrict new CDA waste development. So could you explain how that modification is necessary for the soundness of the plan?
That was added, sir, so it was consistent with our other policy positions in the plan. Obviously, within WP1, we have a similar clause for HC&I waste of no new sites, which I'm sure we're obviously going to come on to discuss later on this morning. And then WP2 as well, we've got a clause similar for other waste streams. I think we noticed that there wasn't one for construction and demolition waste, so it was to introduce that consistency through the policies about no new sites unless it's for compensatory provision. So it was just about consistency, but I'm sure we're obviously going to come on to discuss the principle of that approach as part of the matter this morning.
Okay, are there any further comments on any of those topics? Before I move on to, I'm going to move on to matter, some more detailed questions on matter 3. But in terms of just those general points, is there anything people want to pick up? Okay, so Mr. James, could you outline how the qualifying throughput of sites has been assessed, please?
So in terms of the qualifying throughput, we followed the anthesis study, the technical report, that's document E10 and E11, in assessing what each of those sites could contribute. So we didn't take the maximum throughput that had been achieved on those sites within the 5-year period that was assessed. We looked at how much waste was being managed on those sites and effectively took an average instead of just using the maximum throughput to give us a more, what we felt was more realistic figure about what would be or what could be delivered on each of those sites over a 5-year period. So we felt that was a reasonable approach to take. It sort of smooths out some of those peaks and troughs that occur on some of those sites over a 5-year period to give you a more realistic figure as to what could be delivered in the future, and those were then carried through to the plan itself and set out in each of the sites, and then the summary that's in Appendix 2 of the plan, which has obviously subsequently been updated with the 2 years of additional data that wasn't available at the time that the technical report was published. The technical report went to 2017. We've obviously now data for 2018 and 19, so we've updated that to reflect it following the same approach that we took in the technical report.
Mr. Potter, do you want to come in?
If I may, sir, just picking up on the proposed modification, I think the discussion of yesterday, the boroughs conceded that rather than making the reference specific to a particular year span, it should actually be I think their term was sort of a rolling 5-year period. So I see that they proposed changing 2013 to 2015 and 2017 to 2019. But if this plan is looking forward rather than just fixing a point in the ground, then it would make sense for that wording to be reflected there.
Thank you. We picked that up in yesterday afternoon's discussion, the sort of mop-up session, didn't we, Mr. James, of the main modification? So that's something that's already been flagged.
Yes, that's correct. So obviously moving forward, it would be that 5-year rolling period effectively that we'd be using to assess. But obviously for the purposes of the plan, we've got to use the data that we've got, but obviously that will be updated on an annual basis and reflected in the waste AMR.
Mr. Potter? You're on mute, Mr. Potter.
Apologies. Yes, on that front, whilst the boroughs may not have access, or the waste data interrogator for the 2020 period has not been released yet, we've actually been able to access the site returns that were submitted by our client to the agency. We welcome the reworking that's been presented in the South London Waste Plan Authority's annual monitoring report. We've been able to rework that to reflect the 2020 data for our client site, which I'll just point out has further reduced the identified managed capacity that the site offers. I think yesterday the boroughs confirmed that they saw the site as offering only around 12,000 tonnes of capacity. Our reworked calculations actually show that that's fallen to around 11,000 and is anticipated to fall further still based on what we know of the 2021 inputs so far. And we're happy to provide that reworked data for the site to the examination if you'd find that helpful.
Thinking out loud as we're speaking here, I think, Mr. Potter, I'm just wondering how material that would be. I understand the argument you're making, absolutely. I can understand the reasons why you would say that. It's me just thinking whether or not we accept the fact there is a potential for a decline in throughput at this particular site for various reasons, or we just want evidence at this stage to demonstrate that your reworking of the 2020 figures gives us that information. And my thinking out loud is to suggest that it's probably an accepted perhaps trend as opposed to something that needs to be demonstrated formally, unless council colleagues think differently. My kind of thinking is, I think that there's a general acceptance from what was said yesterday, in my mind anyway, that this particular site may have a decline in throughput for various reasons. So I think putting a line in the sand in 2020 as this is what it was, that perhaps demonstrates that trend at that particular time. Informal evidence submission is probably not necessary. I'm just looking at council colleagues to see whether there's anything I've said there that would cause any problem.
No, we would agree with that. I wouldn't contest the throughput of the sites declining. We saw that in the latest data that we have available, 2019 data, and I would expect to see, as Mr. Potter confirmed, that it would reduce further this year. So I don't think, from our perspective, that would be necessary. We wouldn't contest that the throughput's falling on that site.
I think where that takes us, Mr. Potter, I think there's I can obviously perceive the argument that will be made as well later. But I think there's probably a general acceptance by all parties that the site is on a declining throughput trajectory, and therefore there's no need to formally prove that to us. I think it's accepted by all that is the case.
Thank you for confirming that, sir. And it just really was emphasising the point that also relative to the reworked surpluses that have been identified for the different waste streams. So there were 18,272 tonnes per annum surplus for HCI and 165,286 for C&D. The contributions that our client site make are very small relative to that. So the loss of that capacity, if the site was to be released from safeguarding, wouldn't present any risk to achievement of the plan's objectives of net self-sufficiency or meeting the apportionments.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. Are there any, Mr. Witter?
Can I just clarify the detail behind how we calculated site capacity, actually following on from the consultants' work to 2019, in terms of using the waste data interrogator information. We took the maximum throughput coming into the site over the 5-year period. So, for example, in the latest information in the annual monitoring report, that took the maximum throughput for each of the sites from that 5-year range, 2015 to 2019. And then looking at the outputs from the sites on the waste data interrogator, we actually calculated the average percentage recovered on each site. And I think that approach was necessary because there's not always a match between the input and the output. And it was the approach that the consultants followed, in that the total tonnage coming into the site is actually very reliable. But sometimes the measurement of what happens to that waste is maybe slightly less reliable, but it was felt to be the kind of most accurate way to calculate site capacity in terms of waste management for the purpose of Appendix 1 in the plan, I think it is, or Appendix 2.
Thank you, Mr. Witter. So are there any further reactions to Mr. Potter's input there, Mr. James, before we move on?
Just, I think I said yesterday, again, agree with what Mr. Potter said, that the contribution that site makes to the plan's capacity is less than the surplus that we've got. But I stopped yesterday. I didn't say anything further. So I was waiting the outcome of discussions today about the wider capacity of the plan. But we do acknowledge that if that site were to be removed, we would still have a surplus against both HC&I and construction and demolition waste. That would be a fairly significant surplus in both cases. So I'm basically agreeing with what Mr. Potts just said.
Okay, so moving on in terms of the safeguarded sites that have been identified as having the capacity to be intensified. So what information has been taken into account in reaching conclusions on the ability of those sites to be intensified and the capacity that could be realized as a result of intensification?
So the approach to intensification of the site started again with the technical report that provided the evidence then that we worked from. In terms of a broad overview of that approach, we set that out in paragraph 1.86 of our statement, and very briefly, the technical report established a figure to assess waste management per hectare, which, after assessing all the options, proposed that we use 60,000 tonnes per hectare as our sort of indicative figure to use for assessing intensification. There was then discussion with operators to ascertain site level details and whether or not any of them had plans for intensification during the plan period. Then there was an estimate of possible tonnes per annum increase in the technical report, taking into account any recent planning permissions. And then finally, there was some updates to potential to intensify through the consultation and publication stages, where operators indicated whether intensification was planned or could be achieved within the plan period. So that's reflected within the safeguarded site sheets in the second half of the document. What we've done in the hearing statements was we took that a little bit further. So those sites where we had identified some potential for intensification, based upon that 60,000 tonnes per hectare, we gave some indicative figures about the level of intensification that could possibly be delivered on some of those sites that we've identified for safeguarding within the plan. That was set out in table 3 of our hearing statement on matter 3, which identified quite significant amounts of potentially additional capacity if all those sites came forward for intensification, around 60,000 tonnes per hectare. So I think I'll pause there.
Okay, and could you remind me of the justification for the tonnes per annum per hectare figure, please?
So appendix 3 of the technical report, which is document E11, set out the methodology that the consultants used to calculate those waste management land factors. So they looked at several different approaches that could possibly be used. They looked at what other adopted waste plans had prepared. They sought the views of other stakeholders, which included the GLA and the EA, and they decided that the best approach for us was to take this 60,000 tonnes per hectare, which was an average between the land take for HC&I and construction and demolition waste. Specifically, that was set out within paragraphs 3.1.1 to 3.3.1.2 in the technical report, where they address that. That's within the appendices, I believe.
Mr. Potter, would you like to come in?
If I may, sir, just to reiterate our view around the use of this kind of homogenized average figure. It really doesn't seem to us to be kind of appropriate, particularly in a sort of land constrained area like London, where we know that facilities are going to be designed with very limited footprints to be able to manage waste. You know, we still remain of the view that taking a 60,000 tonne per hectare value is kind of homogenizing the outliers and failing to pick up on what should be seen as sort of the best achievable practice, which is what we think should be used as a performance benchmark. And referring back to our statement, and in fact, your colleague there, Mr. Normington, will be fully aware of this. We note that for the North London waste plan, the assumed tonnes per hectare was revised in the modified version to reflect a much greater intensification that's possible, both for HCI recycling and also for C&D recycling. And we would strongly recommend that those values, and in fact that whole table that has been inserted into the North London waste plan, be utilised for the benefit of the South London waste plan. Quite apart from anything, for you know, for the sake of consistency, why should there be any difference between the North London ability to intensify uses as opposed to that which might occur in South London?
That's the question perhaps to Mr. James, and it comes back to the same challenge I put earlier. If this table was revised, taking into account Mr. Potter's approach, what difference does it make to the plan in terms of modifications or policies within the plan? It obviously will demonstrate that there is more capacity to intensify uses, and I can obviously see the reason why Mr. Potter's making that argument. But in terms of that consistency, and there's a number of ways you can do this, I appreciate that. But even if these figures were to be revised to reflect that consistency, and it would probably revise them upwards, does it make any difference other than being perhaps demonstrating a different approach? Would it make any difference to anything in the plan?
I think at the moment, obviously, table 3 in the hearing statement doesn't appear within the plan itself. So in terms of intensification, we've flagged up which of those sites has the potential, but it doesn't actually specify a figure as you would have seen. I think the 60,000 tonnes per hectare, we never, you know, I certainly never saw that as a cap. It wasn't, we were saying, you know, this is it. It was, obviously it's an average, and it's to give an indication of the likely level of intensification that would come forward. So I don't think we were never applying that as an absolute cap. This is it. If that 60,000 tonne figure were revised, obviously the levels of potential intensification would obviously increase, would go up. What impact that would have on the, I don't think it would really, I don't think I could argue it would have a fundamental impact on the plan, just to show that there's potentially more capacity that could be delivered through intensification if we used a different land take factor. But I mean, it depends if we're looking at a modification that would include indicative figures within the plan or not. I'm not clear if that's what Mr. Potter was suggesting, because at the moment all we do is we identify those sites where intensification could occur, We don't actually specify that figure itself. So I think probably in short, it would just show we've got more capacity, but potentially through intensification, I don't think it would have fundamental impact.
Perhaps bring Mr. Potter. I obviously see the reason why Mr. Potter is making the argument. Absolutely understand that. But it's for me, it's whether or not there's any material benefit. Mr. Potter will probably explain to us in his view, whether there's any material benefit in revisiting intensification opportunity within the plan. And what does that do? I mean, the argument, cut to the nub of the chase here, the argument we're going to get to is the plan over providing effectively in terms of capacity. If there's plenty of provision already and there's plenty of intensification provision, then we're going to get to this argument, no doubt, in a few minutes' time. But just in terms of the plan, and I'll just welcome your views again, but then we'll bring Mr. Potter in. You know, is there any material benefit to revisiting intensification opportunity and capacity, and in material benefit in thinking about how that's reflected in monitoring, to just see, you know, what the kind of relationship between land taking, intensification and opportunity and progression is on that journey. And it's not me trying to put any words into your mouth at all. I'm seeking, you know, what do you think? Is there any benefit in exploring this further within the modifications, or is it an accepted fact that yes, there will be opportunity for intensification of varying degrees throughout the plan period, and it's something we'll monitor and support whatever we can do to maximise land use?
I mean, we're obviously in a, I'll bring you in a second, Patrick. We're obviously in a slightly different position to North London. My understanding is they have a shortfall as opposed to a surplus that we have. So obviously, I guess there's a greater incentive for them to be, you know, seeking more capacity through intensification to try and meet those apportionment figures. Obviously, we're showing our table that we set out in the matter statement showed that there was a potential for 340 approximately to 420,000 tonnes per annum from intensification, which is almost half the apportionment figure that we have at the moment. So on the flip side of what I just said, if we were to use higher land take figures, the intensification potential would go up. What would the benefit if we're saying we've got a surplus against apportionment, we've got a significant surplus against construction and demolition waste? Is there a benefit in showing that we've got even more intensification than potentially 420,000 tonnes per annum, which is 50% of what the apportionment figure is? Perhaps that's something maybe I'd need to reflect on, but I mean, it would be consistent then with the North London Waste Plan. I can see that benefit, but in terms of our own capacity and the flexibility to respond if our apportionment if our capacity went down, I think we've already demonstrated we've got more than enough capacity that could be met through intensification. So perhaps that benefit would be limited. So Pat, did you have something you wanted to come in and say?
I was only going to add a minor point really, but I think following on from our discussion of matter 5 yesterday about plan monitoring and the fact that we are going away to look at how we can get a better link between wider objectives, sustainability objectives. So clearly site intensification lends opportunities for the circular economy, more sustainable kind of waste management practices, etc. How the plan can actually monitor site intensification through the plan period, which is certainly something which is a feasible thing to do, is something which we will be looking at when we're kind of revisiting the monitoring table. That point doesn't kind of address the central point that you were asking my colleague Dean, but I just thought it was worth flagging that up as something which we will be looking at.
I'll just add a small thing, and I'm kind of reiterating what Mr. James said, but I can recall in 2010, 2011, with the adopted South London Waste Plan, this was a lengthy debate issue. And at that time, we also had 60, it was whether it's 60 or 80,000 tons per hectare. And but the rub of the matter is it's more of an issue when you have a capacity gap, because that is the basis of your calculation of the quantum of land you need to safeguard. In this instance, it's less of a matter.
In which case, then can we bring perhaps Mr. Potter back in to have that discussion about the benefits or disbenefits of including anything further in terms of intensification within the plan? I think there's an acceptance that there is significant intensification opportunity. There's an acceptance that that is something that the authorities are looking at in terms of, when I say authorities, it's the boroughs, I need to get the terminology right in London, that the boroughs are going to look at in terms of the annual monitoring report. There's an acceptance, I think, in principle, that those figures are utilising a methodology, and there are other methodologies that can be applied that would probably undoubtedly increase intensification opportunity. And I think there obviously is an acceptance as well that there are substantial sustainability benefits in maximising intensification use at site. So I think in terms of, it's me thinking out loud in terms of your client's position, all of the trends that you are seeking to demonstrate, I think are trends that the council's in principle accepted. So with that kind of caveat, I kind of welcome your thoughts now in terms of whether or not the plan should do something more about intensification.
Sir, thank you. I'll just say, as obviously we're appearing on behalf of our client 777, but as a waste planning professional, I guess I see little logic in not applying a consistent approach between the North London plan, which is now being going forward, and the South London plan. As the borough representatives said, 60,000 or 80,000 was used back in 2010 or earlier when the previous South London Waste Plan was adopted. We know that practices have moved on, and the ability to achieve more within a smaller space is something that's been demonstrated by the industry. So it just seemed to us to make sense for a consistent approach to be adopted. Whether it makes any difference to our particular clients concerned, but it will, of course, have a wider impact from the point of view of potentially any other site operator who is seeking to demonstrate that compensatory capacity exists on other existing sites, for example, through intensification. And I would just really sort of refer back to the proposed modification to para 4.2 that the boroughs are putting forward, relating to to achieve the vision. The South London Waste Plan has the following objectives, which will be delivered through the policies in the plan, and they've said objective 4 is support the need for sufficient land for other industrial uses within the South London Waste Plan areas, industrial estates, by not safeguarding more land for waste management than is required. And they identify the policies through which that's to be delivered. And I would just say, if they're sincere in that objective, in that stated objective, then they should do all that they can at this opportunity to ensure that there is flexibility, and that the sites that are to be safeguarded are their contribution going forward. I say their contribution or potential contribution is maximised and acknowledged.
Okay, I think that there's 2 points come out of that, and it probably leads us into the crucial discussion about whether or not we've safeguarded too much land here. But the first point on that is clearly, yes, there are differences in North London. And I would say that one, I'm not here to try and lobby for consistency. I'm very strict to the imagination. But I think it's probably something to think about, whether or not there is any benefit to recognise that there are differences in approach. And therefore, when we are looking through monitoring, if nothing else, as to how you look at that in terms of land take and whether or not there is any benefit in having consistency across London in the approach, because it will be reflected at some point in the way you're thinking about some of that monitoring, those monitoring indicators. So whilst I appreciate there's no material benefit perhaps in labouring the point in this plan because you're in a completely different position, nonetheless, you'll be monitoring that as part of your annual monitoring, and therefore it's something you may wish to think about when there's any degree of consistency that may be required. And again, it's not something for you to comment on the youth, it's something for you to go away and have a think about to see whether or not, if nothing more than in monitoring, you need to have a consistent approach so that people can compare across London monitoring on intensification. So that does give some certainty, some consistency. Perhaps now leading into the nub of the argument then, and Mr. Potter's led us into that in terms of that objective. And I know we will bring other issues in regarding safeguarding. Where does all that take us now? The kind of cynic in me would say, well, we've plenty of capacity, you've plenty of intensification opportunity. Do you really need all of this land? On the one side, then the other side is, but there are policies in the London plan that take us in a slightly different direction. But from discussions yesterday, there is perhaps a middle ground opportunity that could also arise in recognising where we are and recognising some modifications to other policies may give that opportunity, albeit it may not be at plan policy stage, it may be at application stage. Nonetheless, Mr. Potter and his colleague made the argument yesterday that the first starting point is a local plan process, and leading us into that objective, that and the issues we discussed yesterday about the competing need for employment land in certain areas. Where does that take us? And I'll probably start with yourself, Mr. James, to lead this in for a debate then with Mr. Potter about where we are in terms of the amount of land that we are safeguarding, and how do you square that against that objective, and how do you square that against a desperate need for employment land in some areas?
Thank you, sir. I mean, in terms of the 777 sites, specifically, because this is obviously the only site at this point that's being that's pushing for its safeguard to be released. There was another site, S11, which we already proposed to be released through the modifications, as we can't justify that safeguarding as that planning permission has not been implemented. I mentioned yesterday that at the point that the draft plan was being prepared, the throughput for that site was significantly more than it is now, and its deletion would have resulted in us being below those figures in Appendix 2, which is why we didn't agree for that waste safeguard to be released. We're obviously in a different position now. Those figures have been updated. Appendix 2 shows that its contribution towards the overall capacity of South London is significantly less than it was, and its release wouldn't impact on our ability to meet the apportionment or the C and D arisings. I think there seems to be an emerging consensus that we do have sufficient capacity and that there is significant capacity from intensification too, potentially. I think we accept the arguments made yesterday that obviously in the London plan, we're meant to safeguard existing waste sites, but if safeguards are going to be released, that should be done at the plan-led stage, preferably, and not an application stage. So I think probably where we're going on this is that the boroughs could put forward a modification for that site S777 to be released from its safeguard, if there's obviously consensus that we have a surplus against apportionment and the C&D arising, which I think there is, alongside the potential from intensification. So in terms of Mr. Potter, I think that's where we're at the moment with that specific site, sir.
Mr. Potter, that must be music to your ears, isn't it? And I'll say nothing more than that. You can comment.
We're naturally very pleased to hear that offer being put forward, sir, and welcome that acknowledgement that this nearly hectare site in a prime location could be made available for wider uses than the waste use it's currently identified for.
Not being flippant in that sense, but there obviously is there's an audit trail that one would need to go through that and to justify why this particular case that is a situation. And from what we've heard, I think this morning, capacity, the declining opportunity perhaps at this site and the contribution it's making, and therefore the tension that we have with employment land supply leads you to an outcome against a healthy position of capacity that, in terms of making the best use of urban land, an alternative use wouldn't prejudice the objectives of the plan. Indeed, it would be consistent with some of those objectives. And I'm not putting words into your mouth, you know what to say, but I'm very conscious also in the concession that you've suggested there. You need to be very clear and robust about the reasons for that, and there is an audit trail as to why that is the case. Unless you want to dig the hole any deeper, when you've just got it bottomed out there, Mr. Potter. Is there anything else we need to say there?
With regard to our particular client's interest, no, there's nothing to add. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. James, just to develop what Inspector Normington was saying in terms of the justification and the audit trail for that kind of modification. I mean, obviously, we've got policy SI 9 of the London Plan, criterion A, and then we've got the supporting text to that. Paragraph 9.9.2 that have to be covered.
I think as well, some of the evidence, obviously we spoke to all of the operators, and I think the only instances where people were pushing for the safeguard to be released was this operator, which was across 2 sites on Beddington Lane. Others had the opportunity to present that case, but nobody else did. They were all happy with the continued position of their sites being safeguarded as well, which I think maybe can form part of that argument at least as well, the views of that landowner that's been consistently presented through the process.
Okay, if we could move on to matter 3, Roman numeral 5, 4. So this is the Chessington railhead site. So I'd like to start with this discussion with Ms. Walsh. So could you outline your views on whether the plan's approach to the site is soundly based, and if not, what changes might be necessary to make the plan sound and/or legally compliant in these regards? And also in your response to that, I'd be interested to hear in terms of the permitted development rights that are being exercised that you've referred to in your statements. If you could touch on that as well, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, perhaps if I start off on permitted development rights, just to explain what those are, and then I'll go on to the question of how this plan has approached this particular site and whether we consider it sound. And obviously you'll be clear from our reps that we are in disagreement with the South London Waste Plan authorities on that point. In terms of permitted development rights, under the GPDO Part 8A, statutory undertakers on rail sites are able to progress certain development without need for planning permission. On this site, the statutory undertaker is DB Cargo. Actually, Network Rail themselves are also a statutory undertaker, but it's the rights of DB Cargo that are being used in this particular instance. That allows them to bring in, freight by rail and also take it out by rail. They have signed a 125-year lease for the site. As part of that lease, they are required to use the site for rail-related purposes. So I don't know if it's me or my it's the connection, is it? Yeah, they've taken a 125-year lease on the site. The terms of that lease are that they are required to use it for rail-related purposes. The site has been held by the rail industry for a very long period of time. CPL, who utilised the site previously, were allowed to be on there until it was required for freight uses. They have now relocated elsewhere. They vacated the site in May of this year. Under their development rights, DB Cargo have already started works on the site to repair and upgrade the sidings, which are in place in the site and have been for over 70, 80 years, I believe, and to enable the site to bring in material by rail and also export. They've assigned a 25-year underlease to a minerals and waste operator, Kappa Public Works, who are proposing in the first instance to take waste out by rail for landfill purposes, but they also intend to bring mineral in as well by rail. So it will be a dual-use mineral site, not distinct from the Purley site, which is site C4, already identified in the plan, dual-use minerals and waste site. In the future, they can see, Kappa can certainly see a demand and need in there for their own business requirements, which would sit well with the mineral and waste use site to allow them to recycle on the site and make best use of what is an existing brownfield site previously used for storage and distribution purposes. But just to recap and go back to your permitted development rights points, what DB Cargo are allowed to do for their tenants is bring material in and out by rail, and one leg of that can be by road. So they can bring material into site and export by rail and vice versa. What they can't do under permitted development rights is any industrial development. So any proposal for C&D recycling would require a planning application. So in short, the site leaves us in a position where, irrespective of any safeguarding in the waste plan, it can come forward for waste transfer uses, but as currently worded, the plan would preclude the site from coming forward for recycling uses unless that were under compensatory provision. And our view is that given the particular and unique circumstances of this site, it has some very specific characteristics being taken forward by a statutory undertaker, actively being brought forward now, will be in use for waste transfer probably before the plan is adopted. with a minerals and waste operator installed on the site as well, who are demonstrating and confirming a real-world market demand for waste transfer on this site and for recycling. And given the provisions in the NPPF and the London plan in terms of the requirements of safeguarding rail infrastructure, and with that the provision and support for secondary and recycled aggregates and the way that that sits with the use that's coming forward, our view is with regard to this particular site, the approach and the plan is not sound, it's not consistent with London plan and NPPF requirements. And a critical factor particularly is that it wouldn't benefit from the protection under WP8 in terms of development coming around in the vicinity of existing waste sites, because this site wouldn't be counted as an existing waste site as defined in the plan. So we wouldn't be able to rely on that either, and that is a helpful policy in terms of really drawing down on what the NPPF and London plans say in terms of agent of change. So there's a few issues there in terms of conformity, but the key ones are the site is required under National London Plan policy to be safeguarded. Existing plan and potential sites for rail, it's a clear requirement. Alongside, obviously, that you have your specific waste safeguarding here. I take, and I can preempt potentially what's going to be said here in terms of the significant surplus that there is for C&D recycling. What you need to consider here is that it's a matter of fact that the site is coming forward. It's quite a unique circumstance. And is it really sound not to safeguard this site and identify it, allow it to have the protection of WP8, for example, and to ensure that there isn't an in-principle policy bar on recycling? Clearly, an application would have to be made. Clearly, all other relevant development plan policies will need to be considered. But this is a highly sustainable location, would contribute to circular economy, key sustainability objectives, and they need to be balanced. And irrespective of the capacity gap having been met, and I entirely take the point, significantly exceeded, our view is that if on the one hand you're considering whether you're going to have an additional oversupply, and on the other hand you've got a site that is highly sustainable that would be precluded from C&D recycling where there is a clear market demand for it, our view is that the soundness lies with safeguarding the site and ensuring it has the protection of WP8 and has the potential in the future for C&D recycling. Thank you.
Okay, any initial responses on those points, Mr. James?
Going to bring my colleague in, Tom Bright from Kingston, to respond to those points, sir.
Thank you. First of all, we acknowledge that the site is being brought forward for minerals and waste transfer related uses under these rail-related permitted development rights. Nonetheless, the site is not an existing waste facility. Therefore, it wasn't taken into account when calculating the capacity of the plan to manage C&D waste. We've, as highlighted already, we've already identified a surplus to deal with the C&D waste arisings. Therefore, safeguarding of this site is not considered necessary there's no additional need to identify additional capacity. We've already established that.
Perhaps if I can just explore that further then. It seems to me in terms of what the plan's trying to achieve, this site's ticking all the boxes. It's a sustainable railhead, something that's recognised both in London plan and to some extent recognised in this plan. Irrespective of safeguarding or not, waste management activities are occurring on there. Take your point as to this historic evidence about why it's not safeguarded. But in terms of delivering what the plan's trying to achieve, I'm struggling in my mind to understand the disbenefit versus the benefits of safeguarding. In other words, it's not an alternative land use, it's occurring anyway. In terms of, we've got quite the reverse situation with 7.7 demolition here. In terms of opportunity, it can give you an incredible amount of opportunity longer term. The only thing that's missing is a safeguarding element. And I'm struggling to understand why perhaps there's not a desire to safeguard it. And what I can't get in my mind is what is the planning benefits and disbenefits that the boroughs see about not safeguarding it? Because on the one hand, logic says, well, it's doing everything you want. It's a railhead, it's got capacity. It can do loads of things and manage your waste well into beyond the plan period to the next plan period. And therefore it should be safeguarded. And on the other end, I can see, well, actually, when all this came to being, we didn't have that information. It didn't meet the criteria, so therefore we didn't safeguard it. But here we are now, we're examining the plan and whether or not it should be sound, and we're looking at some of the principles and objectives in the plan, and you kind of, my mental mind is going tick, 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 tick the boxes as we go down there, and then I get to the last box that said, should it be safeguarded? And I'm kind of thinking, I've not heard a compelling argument yet that says it shouldn't be. So it's me kind of challenging you and saying, well, give me the compelling argument then, because I can see all of the benefits. I can see all of the objective criteria met in the plan on the one side. If I go to the negative side where I'm looking at, well, what is the reason for not safeguarding? What are the planning issues here? And my mental picture has got no tick box ticked. So tick me the tick boxes in the other side of the equation to balance me up here. Because I'm kind of not hearing that compelling evidence to understand why the approach suggested by DB Rail is not sensible and sound. And the approach adopted in the light of that could be not sensible and unsound. So it's your opportunity to balance my mental tension up.
We recognise the sustainable benefits of having a site that uses rail for transportation of minerals. And going forward, one thing I'd like to point out as well is that the site has also been sort of promoted as a strategic rail freight site, and this was done through the through representations to the Regulation 18 early engagement consultation on the Kingston local plan in 2019. So Kingston Council will certainly consider that when preparing the local plan, and that's something that's highlighted in policy SI 9 of the London plan, the consideration of safeguarding existing railheads. So that's one thing we'll certainly consider. Nonetheless, but that's not within the remit of this waste plan to safeguard it as a strategic rail freight site. It's only for specific rail related safeguarding. Clearly, well, I can only just reiterate that as things stand, we have identified sufficient capacity. When it comes to reviewing the waste plan, we can certainly consider this going forward, but as things stand at the moment, we're here to principally focus on addressing the waste apportionment set out in the London plan.
So let me put it a different way then. What is the harm in safeguarding it? I can see the benefits. If it were to be safeguarded, other than a matter of principle as to how we've got here, what is the harm in suggesting to DB Rail? Well, we can see the opportunity. We can see that we can maximise the benefits of waste recycling, reuse of secondary aggregates, sustainable transport methodology, We're lined up contractually with a waste recycling operation. We can do everything that the plan wants and more. What is the disbenefit of not safeguarding it? In other words, I'm still trying to get to the nub of this convincing argument as to why wouldn't you safeguard it against all of that background, other than the principle of the historic situation that's led us to this position today? I'm perhaps looking at you, Mr. James, there. I'm challenging you a little bit, but why not?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to rebut the on-site benefits that you've just outlined. I think in terms of Kingston's position, the main argument here is obviously, as you just alluded to, this in principle point about not over allocating land for waste within this plan when we've already identified sufficient capacity on existing sites. I think that's probably the nub of Kingston's point. So, as I said, well, I think we acknowledge everything you said, and it's difficult to rebut that. But from Kingston's point of view, I think it comes back to this principal point about let's not over allocate sites for waste when we've got enough sufficient capacity on existing sites.
This is one of the sites. It's only me. I'm being devil's advocate. I'm not batting for DB Rail. I'm trying to push us to understand. We can be sure about what the arguments are. But this is a site where, irrespective of safeguarding, those waste users are going to recur. The contribution it makes to the plan's capacity is going to happen. The monitoring of that site through annual monitoring is going to happen. So irrespective of safeguarding or not, it is and will be, and considerably well into the future, a substantial, or will make a substantial contribution to the management of waste within the plan area. So against that background, why wouldn't you safeguard it? It's me challenging a little bit further to see whether it is a matter of principle. We can all have principles, but being pragmatic and thinking about what the future might happen. It's different to other sites where, in this particular site, the evidence suggests that it is going to continue as a waste use. Irrespective of safeguarding or not, that will be an important strategic waste facility. And therefore, in recognising that longer term, it can do lots of other things in terms of it might be needed at some time in the future to do lots of other things because it's got the capacity to do that. I'm still kind of struggling in my mind, that other than the matter of principle, why the plan wouldn't be perhaps more proactive in recognising the opportunity, because it can resolve lots of other things. And because of those uses already occurred, it's not like the situation we discussed earlier. Is it taking up valuable employment land? Well, it's not, because that land is going to be used to those uses whether you safeguard it or not. But I do recognise the point that important contribution it makes could also, to some extent, be prejudiced by other protection policies that are in the plan that wouldn't apply because they're not safeguarding. So the kind of wearing just a waste planning head thinks to me, well, of course you should be safeguarding this site. But I'm struggling about the other planning issues that might suggest, well, why wouldn't you going forward? I can understand we've got capacity, but we've got capacity anyway, and we've safeguarded other sites. So kind of the argument doesn't really hold a lot of a substantial weight. But I'm just struggling to really understand why, given the strategic benefit that this site has, you kind of wouldn't recognise that more proactively.
And I just want to develop that point a bit further as well, in terms of, we've heard that the use that will be going on will be waste transfer, but then to do other activities on the site that might push the management waste up the hierarchy wouldn't be permitted in terms of the waste plan. So it could actively frustrate that objective of the waste plan as well. So just in terms of that as well, if you could reflect on that point, Mr. James, in your response.
I think we probably haven't got too much more to add to the arguments we presented in the statement and today. I think perhaps if we could have a conversation amongst ourselves about how we go forward. And I think DB Cargo here this afternoon or for later sessions, and we could give an indication of our position is once we've had one final discussion on that matter. I don't think we could probably add two more to the debate at this point, if that's okay, sir.
Yeah, I think the only other thing to add to the mix is if it's going to be operational before the South London plan's adopted, then it's the implications of policy SI 9 of the London plan, isn't it? Criterion A, existing waste sites should be safeguarded and retained in waste management use. So, you know, that's another consideration that perhaps should be taken in, you know, reflected on when you come into a position on it.
Yeah, understood. So yeah.
Ms. Walsh, is there anything further you want to add?
Unless there's anything further you want clarification on, I think we've covered all the points. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I suggest before we move on to discuss some of the other points on matter 3 that we have the adjournment now, and we'll resume at 11:10.